Welcome, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. I think we got a few people trickling in, but we've got some time. Thank you to everyone who's joined us on Zoom today. We're very excited about this presentation. If you haven't met me before, my name is Craig Maxwell. I'm the local chapter chair for the Southern Piedmont chapter of the North Carolina Native Plant Society. Today we have Rue Warren here, who's going to be talking about Catawba Ecology. Before that, I want to go over a few announcements for our chapter. I want to say just thank you all for coming out today. So the North Carolina Native Plant Society, our mission is to promote the enjoyment and conservation of North Carolina's native plants through education, protection, propagation, and advocacy. We put out quarterly newsletters for the statewide organization each year, and our local chapter puts out newsletters and announcements as well. We organize our own programs. And we have 7 chapters throughout the state, 1 new chapter up in Asheville. If you know anybody in that area that's looking to join, they're just getting formed. It's very exciting. We sponsor university students and their research on native plants, which will actually have some of those grant recipients coming back in February and presenting on the research they're doing with that work. And then we organize things like plant sales and hikes and things like that. If anybody came out yesterday, I see some familiar faces yesterday from the hike. We went out to the Catawba Cultural Center down in Rock Hill and did an hour-and-a-half tour on their greenway there, learned about Catawba agriculture and the native plants that they have there on their land. It was a great hike. Really appreciate everyone that joined us yesterday. I think we had full 25, which was excellent. If you'd like to join the Native Plant Society, our website is ncwildflower.org. You can find more information there. We have different membership levels depending on individuals or students or families. We also have lifetime memberships if you're interested. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Rue. Rue is a member of the Catawba Nation. He is their member-at-large, just recently voted in this year. And from 2017 to 2019, he was the project coordinator for many of the projects they had going on within the tribe, including language revitalization, educational outreach, a few other ones. But he's been doing a lot of work for the tribe, and it's really impressive the work he's doing. So I'm going to turn things over to him, and thank you, Ruth, for joining us.
Yeah. Hello. Good night. Napinetem niya DeLesslin George Warren niya item Rue ye Ismare ye Katabare ye Kapitsa Wachahere. Hatuna Captain Corinne George Warren, Yaksuna Wanda George Warren, Yaksuna Hatuye, Dr. Wadona Hare, Imbarana Aiden George Warren, Tatewana Bob George, Nemusa Chure, Christian Tengono, Hawo, Nitem, Hawo, Craig, Hawo, North Carolina Native Plant Society, Hawo, Manu, Hawo, Wapit, Hawo, Buksu. Hi. Like Craig said, my name is Rue. My government name is DeLesslin George Warren, so you might see that pop up in various places, but everyone's called me Rue, like kangaroo, since I was born, so please feel free to call me that. I am a citizen of Catawba Nation. I grew up right off the reservation in the sprawling metropolis of Rock Hill, South Carolina, but now I live on the reservation with my husband, Christian Tengono. My grandfather was our assistant chief for about 30 years, sorry. That's him over on the left side. My mom was our tribal administrator for a decade in the 90s and early 2000s. That's her over there. And so I was very lucky to grow up in the cultural, social, historical life of the tribe. My aunt is also our cultural center director, has been since 1989. So I had a lot of these experiences very young. When I went off in high school, I was like, I'm getting out of here. I never want to come back here again. Thankfully, I had some great experiences in college, namely a professor who directed me towards writing by different Native authors about our historical context, what had happened over the last 500 years, and also our kind of contemporary situation. And all these things together inspired me to eventually come back to Manu Wui Ila, the land of the river. In our language, we call ourselves Ye Isware, the people of the river, because we lived along the river for a long, long time. After college, I studied opera in college and realized I didn't really want to do classical music, but I love attention, so I was going to keep performing. I've done lots of different kinds of performances, but probably one that gets picked up the most is called the Indigenous Core of Discovery, which is named after the Lewis and Clark expedition, which was originally called the Core of Discovery. And it was started in 2016 leading up to the presidential election, because when I was in DC looking at the museums, particularly the Presidential Portrait Gallery, I was kind of astonished at how little mention there were of Native people. For example, Andrew Jackson, who's standing behind me in this photo, the only mention of Native people in that was that he had a complicated relationship with them. Which is quite a euphemistic word, right? And so I continued doing these tours throughout 2016. I later did the tours at the Utah Museum of Fine Arts as part of a Buffalo Bill Wild West show exhibition. And then in September, so a year ago now, at the Nordic Museum in Seattle, Washington, where they were doing an exhibition of 19th century American and Norwegian railroad photography. So I was about neck deep in 1800s Norwegian photographer history, which was a very interesting sort of research situation to be in. In 2017, I got a small grant to come back to the community to work on language. Our language, our last speaker died in 1959, which is another significant year for a reason you'll hear about in a little bit. And so in the 1990s, when our cultural work was really getting underway, we had some funds to do a big community survey, and we said, what's important to you? Economics, job opportunities, per capita payments, language, culture, like what do we care about as a community? And even above economic development, job opportunities, per capita payments, culture, pottery, language was ranked highest in our community. So it's been a priority for us since I was in diapers. Unfortunately, native languages are one of the most underfunded areas in Indian country. It's very, very difficult to get that funding. And so that's been something that I've been working on, not just the language, but also the funding part. But when I came back, what I realized was, our language doesn't have words for cell phones, right? Because our last speaker passed away before cell phones, computers, a lot of these things, but it does have lots of words for Manu, for the land and all the things that inhabit the land that are surrounded by us. And so I realized I couldn't really learn about our language. I couldn't learn the language until I learned the land. And so it was in 2018, 2019 that I started working on our food sovereignty work, mostly bringing together all the people who are already doing it in our community, farmers, people working in roads and transportation and lands, people working in healthy eating, healthy lifestyles, diabetes prevention, and of course our cultural center to talk about what does food sovereignty mean for us. And I'm going to talk more about that work later on in the presentation. Like Craig said, just in end of July, I was elected to our executive committee, which is the elected leadership of our tribe. I'm one of 5 members on the executive committee. This is also an exciting executive committee because in addition to having the first LGBT person, LGBT person on the executive committee, we also have our first female assistant chief in modern history, which is a really, really exciting thing for our community. But I won't talk too much about that political work. Mostly I'm going to be talking about our history and our community life. So before we get into history, I want to start with a little bit of perspective. So one, kind of moment that we think of in US history as being a long, long time ago is, of course, the Declaration of Independence, July 4th-ish, 1776. Depending on how you count it. And I think this is a couple of years out of date. It was a little bit more than 244 years ago, but about 250 years ago that this was created. So what are some things that are older than the Declaration of Independence, which we consider a very old document? Well, this shark, which lives in Greenland. Scientists believe that this shark is approaching 400 years old, a Greenlandic shark, because it's in such cold water. Its metabolism is very slow. It lives a long, long time, which means that it was being born around the time that Jamestown was being established, right? Something that's older than Jamestown is this bald cypress tree here in North Carolina, right? A little bit farther east than here, which scientists believe the particular individual was sprouting around 604 BC, so 2,500 years ago. Something older than that, Nebuchadnezzar. That was about the time Nebuchadnezzar was building the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. But something older than that is the Bristlecone pine, which has been dubbed Methuselah, out in California, which they think was sprouting in about 2,800 BC, about 5,000 years ago. And something that's older than all of these things is Catawba culture. So archaeologists have different theories about how old pieces of Catawba culture are. Anywhere between 4,000 to 10,000 years ago. That means things like finding pottery shards, different archaeological sites, mitten sites, those sorts of things, burial mounds. But for us, the exact year doesn't matter too much because we know that who we are as Catawba people has come about upon these lands, that we come from the lands themselves. And I don't have enough time today to tell you our creation story, except to highlight a few things. One is that it features a very pushy butterfly in the story. It also, unlike other Genesis stories, begins with a first woman, not a first man. And that is an important cultural difference that's going to come up a few more times in my presentation. So, what were we doing in those 4,000 to 10,000 years? I think sometimes we have this idea that indigenous communities are frozen in time, doing the same thing day after day, kind of in a Dantean sort of stuck in hell idea that there was no change over this time. But that's not quite true, right? Because all people are constantly confronting this question, how do we survive, right? And for one thing, the ecosystem, the climate was not static. Survive, how do we survive, how do we survive? And so Catawbas, like all people, were experimenting with this. One way of approaching this question is how do we survive in relationship with the landscape? And so, like many other indigenous communities, Catawbas practice a type of controlled burning. We often think of wilderness in kind of the Thoreau idea of wilderness as being a little bit what you see out here, but this is kind of a nice forest. Like imagine a forest on the side of the road where it's all scraggly and dense and difficult to walk through. But the first explorers from Europe who came here would have interacted with an ecosystem much closer to this, right? And many of them noted that, for example, one said in the early 1600s that you could drive a full carriage with horses straight through the woods because he's looking at this sort of ecosystem, not a dense, scraggly forest. And of course, this has many advantages. One is that a lot of our important medicinal plants, a lot of the plants that you probably work with and talk about, much prefer this sort of ecosystem to the dense forest that predominates now. What else loves this sort of ecosystem? Deer. And what loves to eat deer? We love to eat deer. So it kind of works out for everybody. In addition to relating with the ecosystem, it's also relating to our material culture, developing an artistic tradition. And much has been said about Catawba pottery. It's probably the most famous thing about my community. I love it a lot. I'm not going to spend much time talking about it, but if you have questions, happy to answer them. And then also figuring out how to relate to one another, right? Again, there's this idea that indigenous communities were living in small, isolated villages. But the fact is that many indigenous communities were experimenting with metropolitanism, experimenting with cities and high density living. This is a model from Cahokia, which is near modern day St. Louis, Missouri. And it was inhabited up until about 1400 AD. And when you talk to tribes who have ancestors from Cahokia, a lot of them have stories that they were finding it unsustainable, that they couldn't continue to live in this level of density, this level of resource use. And so they changed to a different mode of living. And so all of these things together create what in Catawba we could call Bagrere Cheheng, which is the circle, right? The bringing the tie, it literally means to tie a rope together around something, which is how do we bring together the people, the ecosystem, the culture, the built environment, all together in a way that sustains us for a long time. And I think particularly in this moment today, this is a question that we're all thinking about. How do we sustain ourselves for another 100,000, 10,000 years into the future? And so in this way, I think indigenous communities have a lot to share. Now, my grandfather grew up working on his relatives' farms, on other farms. He was the first person in my tribe to go to college. He went on a football scholarship to Clemson University in the 50s. He actually later got recruited by the Washington team, whose name I will not repeat, and and was actually set to play with them professionally until he busted up his knee in the preseason. But thanks to that experience of going to college, he was able to return back to our community, and was also one of the first Catawbas to be able to work in the mills, which predominated in this area, particularly down in Rock Hill. And so through that, he had a lot of job experiences. But growing up, I have many memories of helping him with his farm. Yes, sir.
What's his name again?
Buck George.
Okay, thank you.
Buck George, yeah. So Buck George, I remember helping Buck George in his big red truck out of his farm, or out of the church farm is what it's called. And I just have memories of pulling what felt like miles and miles of potatoes out of this tilled, mostly sterile ground. And so this kind of asks the question, how do we get from this sort of resource management into this kind of resource management, right? Where we're having to put in fertilizers every year. It's hot, very manually intensive. It's often one type of plant growing in an entire field. And so how do we get from bagre cheheng to dra katere, which means to cut, to be broken down the middle? How do we get from there to here? So we're gonna go back and talk a little bit about history. First, let's talk about the term colonialism. It's a word that gets thrown around a lot, and I feel like a lot of time we don't take a moment and actually say, what does this word mean? There's also a billion different definitions. The definition I like to use is a kind of academic one, and it says it's a process where relationships between people and landscapes, not just people, but also the lands, are restructured, changed around, to extract value from the colonies, these circles on the outside, and redistributed it to the metropole. And this term metropole is, again, very academic, but the purpose of it is to point out that it's not just a geographic center, right? It's not just London, but it's the richest people in London, right? A lot of people are benefiting on that trip of resources up to the richest people in London. But is all for the purpose and the goal of adding value to those people in the center. Now, the most classic way of thinking of colonialism is really related to the British Empire, right? And its relationship with all of these places all around the world. We're also very used to thinking about it in terms of slavery. And this also illustrates how those relationships between people and lands get rearranged, in which indigenous peoples from Africa get removed from their landscape, get forced across the ocean, and then put into servitude, right? Similarly, indigenous people in North America getting moved down to the Caribbean to be enslaved labor there as well. So this rearranging of relationships is really important, because we spent those many thousands of years of arranging our relationships with the land, and colonialism restructures them. Okay, so that's all very good, like all in the air, but like how do you actually accomplish that goal? And I usually talk about there being kind of a three-part system in the US. There was three different methods that were primarily used. One is extermination, the physical destruction or social political destruction of people, removal, so removing indigenous people from their land, or assimilation. And so that's incorporating indigenous people into the colonial project, the settler project. And what is the purpose of all these things? Well, in the United States, this is often described as solutions, answers to the Indian problem. In the 1800s, you read so much in policy of the United States about the Indian problem. And what is the Indian problem? The Indian problem is that Indians have land and the United States wants it. And so if you go the route of extermination, for example, George Washington in 1779, so this is the Revolutionary War, he says to General John Sullivan, he says that the immediate objectives are the total destruction and devastation of their settlements and the capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex as possible. It will be essential to ruin their crops in the ground and prevent their planting more. If you destroy the people, they no longer exist on the land. And so who gets the land? Well, the United States gets the land, right? Jefferson repeated this in 1813. This unfortunate race, I believe he's talking about the Creek have by their unexpected desertion and ferocious barbarities justified extermination and now await our decision on their fate. They're pretty explicit. Their early presidents in particular are pretty explicit about this kind of stuff. And then we have many, many more examples all the way until about 1900, the massacre of Tallahatchie, which was overseen by Andrew Jackson, in which he finds a young child trying to nurse at the breast of its dead mother. When he's notified of this child being there, he writes to his wife and says that I'm bringing home an Indian boy to make him a part of our family. A very weird moment in Andrew Jackson's history. The massacre at Sand Creek, the massacre at Wounded Knee, both very famous acts of destruction by the United States. There's removal, right? And if you learned anything in school about Native history, it's probably about removal, about the Trail of Tears, the longest walk. And Jefferson is kind of, we think of Jackson being the one, but it's Jefferson who first articulates the idea of removal as early as the late 1700s. And Jackson's just kind of the first one who implements the policy. But we often hear about it as this kind of one-time horrible event with Jackson, but practically every president up until Teddy Roosevelt oversees their own removal of tribes in the United States. Abraham Lincoln, for example, oversees the removal of the Navajo in what's called the longest walk, which is kind of one of the central memories in modern Navajo identity. And then the last one is the one that we hear the least about in our education, but the one that I would argue has been the most effective in destroying culture, destroying knowledge about our ecosystems, and that's the idea of assimilation or civilization. Again, Thomas Jefferson talks about this idea as early as 1790, and he kind of starts sowing the seeds. For example, in the early 1800s, when he's president, he starts what he calls the Civilization Project, and he starts sending out missionaries to different tribes. And what do the missionaries bring with them? Well, they bring with them knowledge of how to do agriculture in the European way. They bring plows and tillers and other tools of European-style agriculture. And so very explicitly, civilization is tied to this idea of tilling the soil, planting everything in a monocrop, these kind of European ideas of agriculture. I'll skip over this Jefferson quote, skip over this one. But this policy comes to its most terrible end during the era of Indian boarding schools. Who's heard of Indian boarding schools before? Okay, so most people here have, very briefly. This is a policy of the United States in which, with or without the permission of the tribe or a family, Indian agents would show up at a reservation. They would take children tens, hundreds, thousands of miles away to one of these institutions. This is the Carlisle Indian Boarding School. It was kind of the prototype school for the Indian boarding school system. When they arrived, their beautiful regalia would be removed from them and burned. They would be washed down, often scrubbed, because it was assumed that all Indians had lice. They would then be put into the same uniform that everyone else was wearing. They would then be told to pick an English name. Many of these children had never ever heard or spoken a word of English before they started interacting with the boarding school. And then if they spoke their traditional language, there would often be some really dire consequences. One of the children that went to this boarding school, who was a Navajo code talker, he talks about years later when he enters the United States military in World War II, they are asking him to speak the Navajo language as a way of having this kind of unbreakable code, so that the Nazis wouldn't be able to break this code. And they did, a lot of these people did, and it was a really important part of the war and something the United States really celebrates. But he talked about how after going through the boarding school system and entering the military, when the same government that had told him never to speak his language, when they told him to start speaking his language, that he could still taste the taste of lye soap in his mouth from when they had washed out his mouth every time he spoke Navajo during his life in the school. And the last thing about Carlisle is that Catawba, there were some Catawbas, about less than 10, but some Catawbas that went to the Carlisle Indian boarding school. One of those children, Wade Ayers, died there in the early 1900s at the age of 12. We don't really know what happened to him. The only note that was on his records was inoculation, was what it said. And we recently, his family very recently, this past, actually 1 year ago, attempted to try and bring Wade Ayers' body home to be reburied on the reservation. And that week, when he was supposed to come back, they opened up his grave at the Carlisle Indian boarding school. And what they found inside was not the body of a 12-year-old boy, but the body of a young woman, like 18 years old. And the reason for this is because when the school stopped being a school and became kind of a military center during the World Wars, they moved the children's cemetery across the property. And then when they put the bodies back together, they didn't really pay attention to where they were putting them. And so it looks like Wade Ayers will never come back to our community, because we're also not going to try and force other tribes to dig up their own children so we can find Wade Ayers' body. So this is an important thing. It's a hard thing, but it's an important thing because when we look at a lot of the issues in our communities, domestic violence, interpersonal violence, loss of culture and language, most of us tie it back specifically to this United States policy, because these children are removed from their homes and they're not being raised with the language. They're not being raised with how to hunt, how to fish, how to grow the plants, how to harvest, how to forage, all this important data. And when you look at explorers' texts, they often note that these tribes didn't have domestic violence. There wasn't this idea of like physical violence being a part of education. And yet after the boarding school system, you see this wave of domestic violence inside of tribal communities, because that's the only way that these children have been raised, right, by these schools, was to associate education and violence. Yeah, so the question was that there was a lot of religion tied into this. And has there been a shift in tribes kind of reclaiming their traditional spiritualities? Yeah, absolutely. And it's for a number of reasons. One is a big change in policy. The Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed in the 1970s. And for the first time, this is the 1970s, for the first time, tribal spirituality was protected, which means that traditional dances, ceremonies, for the first time was actually protected by US law. Prior to this, in some states, it was illegal for tribal citizens to practice a lot of their spiritual traditions. So part of this is a legislative change, a hard-fought legislative change. Part of it is for the exact reasons that you're talking about, was this association of religion with these boarding schools, with this history. And that's similar in my community. Catawba Nation is predominantly Mormon. About 90% of our tribe is Mormon or was raised in the church. I grew up in the religious minority of the tribe, the Southern Baptists. But yeah, it's a big part of it. And what's interesting about when the Mormon missionaries came was we actually had 150 years of missionaries coming to Catawba Nation, but none had luck before Mormon missionaries came. And part of the reason was because Catawba spirituality, like a lot of indigenous spiritualities, is very open to possibilities. And so these missionaries come with these stories, and Catawbas are like, oh, that's a great story. We're going to add it to our stories. And the missionaries are like, no, that's not what we're trying to do here. Yeah, so it's very interesting religious history as well. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Sorry, I was just really interested to hear that there wasn't a problem of domestic violence for the, methods of schooling. So I don't know very much about like the Catawba Nation. I'm wondering, like pre-colonialism, was it a more, like in terms of how Catawba society is organized, was it more patriarchal or matriarchal or egalitarian?
Very matrilineal, very matriarchal, but also this essential idea that no one is expendable, right? And so you see this coming up several times over and over again, which is not just that, it's not that one gender has more power than the other, but just the idea that everyone has a role. And lots of different tribes approach this in different ways. For example, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is up in what we now call New York State, they had the what we might call the Congress of Mothers or the Council of Mothers, and they were the only ones that could decide whether or not to go to war. because their philosophy was that you have to know what it is to bring life into the world to damn people to death like that. For Catawbas, women have always had a really important role, often a decision-making power role, and particularly, and this comes up in just a minute, related to land. Who makes decisions related to land? Not the men, but the women make decisions related to land. Yeah, and so part of that is also the idea of what you might call like individual sovereignty or personal sovereignty. So instead of like there's a state and it's sovereign, and then individuals within it have rights because of that state and the laws of that state, it's kind of the opposite, where it's all of these people are sovereign individuals, and often extended to other things like Wonks, the possum, is a sovereign individual. I can't tell it what to do, right? I can maybe kill it or put it in a cage, but I can't make it change its mind. And so all of these individuals have this sovereignty, and it's only from coming together and making decisions together that you have this larger idea of community sovereign or national sovereignty. And of course, part of that is around sexual choices and who you want to relate to or not relate to. And that actually brings us perfectly to the first time we met Europeans. So the first Europeans that we met was in 1540. Anyone know who the person was that was kind of leading this European expedition? Huh?
Pedro?
Hernando de Soto, close, but Hernando de Soto, right? So he is coming from Spain. He's just come off of a mission in Peru. The crown said, you did such a great job there, we're gonna send you to Florida. He hops off his boat in Florida, and he is looking kind of explicitly for gold. We sometimes think that all the conquistadors were, but they were looking for lots of different things, but he was really explicitly looking for gold. And when he gets off the boat in Florida, he's asking around like, oh, where's the gold, where's the gold, where's the gold? And he said, we don't know where that is, but if you head north to some of the cities there, they have a lot of things. And so he heads north through what we now call Georgia, through most of South Carolina, and he gets to what is modern day Camden, South Carolina. He's sitting on one side of the river and he's waving across the river to this big city that they can see. The city sends across a scout. The scout says, what do you want? He says, look, I want to speak to your leader. And so then Hernando de Soto and his men are waiting and they're waiting and waiting. And eventually they see this big canoe being rowed across the river by 5 presumably very handsome Catawba men. And in the middle of it is this very tall woman who in some stories are described as being completely naked except for a long string of pearls wrapped around her neck, and then fell all the way down to the ground. And she steps off the canoe and she says, Tanake, I'm the lady of Kopacheki. I'm in charge here. What do you want? Right now, imagine his surprise, right? Kind of a different context. At this time, actually, the Spanish crown was ruled by a woman, but only because of a relationship to men, right? Whereas this woman isn't talking anything about that. She's just saying that she's in charge. He says, we're looking for gold. She says, we don't know what that is, but you're welcome to stay with us for a while. So the story goes that they stayed for 1 month or 1 moon. And at the end of that time, the lady of Kopacheki goes to Hernando de Soto and says, it's time for you to leave. Now, any guesses why they had worn out their welcome in that 1 month, that 1 moon?
They ate everything.
Yes, they ate everything. How annoying. They ate everything and, importantly, didn't help. They just consumed without actually putting any work in, which is a very annoying thing to do. So that's one reason. I think there's 2 other possible reasons.
Like they treated the women?
Yes, whoever said that, the way they treated the women, right? So that is a serious issue. And then a third one.
Disease.
Very good, disease. The third one is disease. And something to think about, this group might have a better answer than other groups, but something to think about is, we hear a lot about disease in the history of colonialism. I think sometimes it's even used as an excuse and saying, oh, it was just disease that decimated native populations. But one thing we don't talk a lot about is, why was it so unilateral? Why were there so many diseases that came from Europe, but so few, if any, diseases that came from the Americas back over to Europe? Something to think about. We'll come back to it later. So she says, it's time for you to leave your disease, your harassment, and you're eating all the food. And Hernando de Soto responds by lowering his weapon to her head and saying, not unless you show us where the gold is. So being the smart Catawba woman that she is, she says, okay. We know where the gold is. We were totally hiding it from you. I'll show you where it is, but you have to leave everyone alone. And so she guides Hernando de Soto and his men west to the mountains. And what do we call these mountains? The Smokies, because it's so foggy in the morning sometimes. It's like a big campfire smoke, right? And she knew this. She was a well-traveled woman. Most indigenous people at the time were well-traveled or knew many things about places far away. She gets into the mountains one morning when the fog is particularly thick. She and the women that came with her hop up. They flee back down to Catawba territory. It's the last we hear of her, but I imagine when she gets there, she says, "You will not believe what just happened to me." So this is the last, one of the last times we meet Europeans until the 1600s, when Charlestown gets established, important trade hub. Catawbas very quickly established themselves as trade partners. In the late 1600s, there's a few interactions of Catawbas, mentions of Catawbas in the record. One really interesting document from that time, and I don't have a copy of it to show you, but we recently got a copy of it at our tribal archives, is some sort of agreement about like mutual security and trade with, I think it was Charleston. And it's this document, and there's a bunch of snake shapes that are made on it. And if you know anything about Catawbas, we love black snakes. They're really, really important for us culturally. They're a symbol of protection. They're a symbol of warriors. And so there's all these snake marks that are to indicate Catawba signatures. And under them, someone came and wrote down kind of a description of each person. It said Catawba warrior, a Catawba warrior, a Catawba woman, a Catawba woman warrior, a Catawba warrior. And so you see, even in the 1600s, Catawba women fulfilling many different roles that would have been thought of as kind of unacceptable in the colonies. But by the 1700s, that big city of Copichequi and other related big cities have kind of disappeared. And in their place are these confederacies of different smaller villages. Any guess about why this drastic change in society in just under 100 years?
Because the individual tribes were being decimated by disease and whatever, so they were so small in number, they had to group together. Yeah,
so joining together in kind of a confederacy to protect each other. And I think you hit on the main key of why these big cities no longer existed, which is, of course, we don't know for sure, but the leading theory that I've heard that's most convincing to me is that there's huge waves of diseases coming through right after the Spanish first come through here. And very quickly, it's easy to observe, like, if you've got a bunch of people in one small place, disease spreads faster than if you have fewer people spread out. And so that is my theory. I lend myself to that theory, that that's why we go from these big city states into these smaller village construction. Now, in the 1700s, Catawbas are living with under 20 villages, and this is what's called the Catawba deerskin map. It was created, there's some debate about whether it's Cherokee or Catawba. I think, and it's not just because of Catawba, I think that there's an argument, a strong argument for why this is actually a Catawba document. And so I want to explain a little bit about what you're seeing. Over on the left side is Charleston. In the center is a bunch of Catawba villages. Up in the top right is Cherokee, that big circle, and the next to is Chickasaw. And down in the bottom right is Virginia. So imagine the way we think of maps, and it's just completely rotated on its head. What do you notice about the use of shapes on this map?
The Indian, the native ones are more inclusive and less rigid and structured than the European ones.
Yeah, very literally, the native communities are circles, and the two colonies all have lots of right angles in them. And that is due very much to architecture, right? Charleston, Virginia, lots of corners, lots of right angles. But tribal villages all centered around the ideas of circles, roundness. Here it is done as a line drawing, And then here it is kind of turned and spread out so that you can kind of see exactly how it is arranged. And you see you can go South Carolina into North Carolina, pretty much where we are right now. It's one of the village sites, the Nassau. And then of course, Charleston down the bottom right.
Back up.
Mhm.
Who's drawing this?
This is, well, that's the debate, is whether or not it's a Catawba or Cherokee person, but it's
Okay,
been
but
referred
that's-
to as the Catawba deerskin map.
Yes, who's drawing this?
I don't know what source this is from. I think it was from Dr. Brooke Bauer's book. Yeah, Dr. Brooke Bauer.
But is it representative of a historical or is it?
So this map was made in 1714 to 1724. I can't remember the exact year. And it's being delivered to the colonies. And so then this is it, but just rearranged superimposed on how we think of the map today. And the reason why I think that it's a Catawba map and definitely not a Cherokee map is because our primary economic resource or primary development at this time was through trade. And Catawbas are saying here, hey, Charleston, do you need to get to Virginia? You have to come through us to get there. Hey, Charleston, instead of going all the way around to get to the Cherokees and Chickasaw for trade, you just trade with us because we're already trading with them, right? We are great partners in this burgeoning market economy. And then, of course, that's the
Is that the figure of a person outside town?
Yes, that's and this is a really important trail connecting the Piedmont Carolinas up into Virginia. It's used a whole bunch by different tribes. In fact, at one point we were using it so much to go up to what's now New York State to fight with the Mohawk up there, that Virginia had to negotiate a treaty with us and the Mohawk to get us to stop fighting along that trail because it was disrupting trading a bit. Did you have a question about?
Actually, it was the same thing, but with the upside down one.
Yeah, and we don't know for sure, but I think it's supposed to indicate that that's a trail that could be walked. Great. Yeah. All right. Okay, so we're talking about the early 1700s. In this time, there's a lot of consolidation. These villages are shrinking in number constantly. At one point, an explorer in the early 1700s mentions that there's more than 12 different languages being spoken in one small village of about 5,000 people, an immense amount of linguistic diversity. It's also why today Catawba is a kind of a complex language. It's more like English than it is, say, Spanish or Italian, where it's having lots of different linguistic influences, some related, some unrelated to each other. But by 1863, there is a treaty that is signed with Catawba Nation called the Treaty of Augusta of 1763. And in that treaty, all of that traditional territory that Catawbas have been living in, all claim to that is given away in exchange for 144,000 square acres, which you can see in that yellow box up there on the border of North Carolina, South Carolina. Reason why it's not in North Carolina is because when the treaty was being negotiated, the representatives from the North Carolina colony said that they didn't want to have anything to do with Catawbas. And so when we think about the border between North Carolina and South Carolina, that triangle here is formed because of that treaty of 1763. So whenever you're crossing from Charlotte down into Rock Hill area, Fort Mill, Carowinds, you're crossing into our treaty territory from 1763. And here's another version of it. Carowinds is right about here. Of course, Charlotte and Pineville right here. Now, why 1763? Why did this treaty get signed in 1763? Well, it was an attempt to kind of clean up a proclamation that had been made that year by the King of England. He proclaims that no British subjects are allowed to settle across this line called the Proclamation Line of 1763. Part of this is to try and stop tribes that are west of this line from attacking settlements and colonies of England. So trying to kind of play that diplomacy with those tribes. In the end, though, it didn't really stop individuals from moving across the line. What it did stop was land speculation by British subjects west of that line. And who are some of the most famous land speculators in US history? George Washington, for example, other people involved in the revolutionary efforts, which is why this group of revolutionaries very early on says this accusation of the king that he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Anyone know what this quote is from? It's from the Declaration of Independence. So if you are friends with a lot of Native people on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, merciless Indian savages starts to pop up a lot around July 4th. Because when we think of July 4th, we think of this text from the Declaration of Independence. Also, just as an aside, we learned a lot about the Declaration of Independence in school. And I didn't realize until I was an adult doing this work, we never actually read the Declaration of Independence. We talk a lot about it, we didn't actually read it. So yeah, they are angry. A lot of these wealthy people who are heading up this revolutionary idea are angry because they can't speculate across this line. It is kind of an interesting moment. As I quoted earlier, George Washington orders one of his generals to go on this rampage of destruction, to not listen to any treaty of peace, specifically to the Haudenosaunee up in the New York State area. And Catawba's had a different experience because we aligned ourselves very early on with the revolutionaries, with the patriots. And the reason why is because some of the leaders of that patriot movement in Charleston had promised us explicitly that if we fight with them, that they would honor that 1763 treaty of the 144,000 square acres. By the revolutionary period already, there's more and more settlers moving to the area. Most are still asking us at the beginning of the Revolutionary War if they're allowed to move onto our treaty land and exchange pay, basically rent to us. But by the end of the Revolutionary War, by the early 1790s, many have moved onto the land who haven't asked permission. The leases have kind of exchanged hands and the new leaseholders aren't paying us rent anymore. And so in the early 1790s, George Washington is going on this tour, new president, going on the tour of all the new states. He travels through what's now Lancaster, South Carolina, and a group of Catawba chiefs go out to meet him. And the only record we have of their conversation is in his notebook. He writes, the Catawbas seem to be concerned that someone is going to take away their land. 5 years later, 1796, Catawbas actually go all the way up to George Washington's plantation in Virginia, Mount Vernon. And the only record we have of this meeting is he writes a letter to his Secretary of War. The Secretary of War was in charge of relationships with tribes. And he says that the Catawbas have incommoded me for several days at my home. Let this not happen again. And I said, what does incommoded mean? And it means inconvenienced, right? And George Washington was someone that we literally fought shoulder to shoulder with in the French and Indian War, someone who advocated for us to be allies during the Revolutionary War. So this long-term friend who by the 1790s has completely disregarded us and our concerns. So in 1796, as the Catawba contingent is returning from George Washington's Mount Vernon, they stop in, they come back down to the territory, they deliver the bad news that George Washington doesn't care. And so Catawbas have to find a way of protecting the remainder of their land. One of their friends, who was a wealthy landowner in the area, suggests that all of the remaining Catawba land, so this is housing land, agricultural land, ceremonial land, burial grounds, all of that remaining land be put into the name of Sally New River and other women of the Catawba Nation. We don't know exactly what they discussed at that meeting, but by the end of it, all of the remaining Catawba land had been put into the name of Sally New River and other women of the Catawba Nation. And this is kind of a spectacular moment, right? This is more than 100 years before women's suffrage in the United States, and Catawbas are already showing this very different idea about the role of women in society, that it's not up to the men to decide what happens to the land, that this is actually specifically a job for women. This is a portrait by Alex Osborne, who's a Catawba artist. I did have his website, but I guess I left it off at tanakealex.com. I can give that to you later if you're interested. But this is a portrait of Sally New River.
What's behind her?
I think it is a black snake. Yeah, again, protector. Black snakes are protectors for us.
So what was the point of putting all the land in women's names?
Yeah, great. So the question is, what is the point of putting all the land into the name of the women? The theory was, okay, they're not going to respect this treaty terms, but maybe they'll respect property rights. So if we put it into a land title, show clear property ownership over the land, then maybe that will prevent the further taking of that land. Yeah, great. Thank you for that question. And so Sally New River protected that land all the way until her death in the 1820s. After she died, there was a group of Catawba chiefs who were really raised by Sally New River who continued to protect that land. But after they passed away, things changed really drastically. And so in 1840, South Carolina came and negotiated a treaty with Catawba Nation in which all of that remaining land was given up to the state of South Carolina. In exchange, Catawbas would be given money to go and live with the Cherokee up in the mountains here. By this point, Catawbas and Cherokees have been on the opposite of every war for the last 500 years. Did not work out well. Within a year, most of the Catawbas returned back down to our traditional territory, that treaty area. But had no claim to any of the land legally. And so we're, in a literal sense, homeless in our own homelands. A few years after that, there was another wealthy landowner in the area who purchased about 680 square acres of land, put that into trust with the state of South Carolina. And that's actually where our reservation is today. So to reiterate, traditional territories there in the kind of Piedmont area in the middle, 1763 treaty territory, and then today our reservation lands. The yellow circle is the and you can see kind of the border of North Carolina, South Carolina up in the top corner there. The yellow circle is that 680 square acres of land that was bought back and put into trust by a friend. That is what we call the old reservation today. It's where our tribal government building is, it's where our cultural center is. And then that red territory is also our reservation land. It wasn't purchased back by the tribe until 1995. Yeah. Yes.
Can you return to the last map? And of the land that we're looking at, I'm trying to place where were the traditional lands.
Yeah. So the question is, where were the traditional lands on the map that we're looking at? Okay, so imagine miles north and then miles south. That's traditional land. But the treaty land would be up to here, all the way down to here, kind of circumscribing a square there. So all that land shrinking down to here.
Who named the Catawba River? Did they name it after your tribe?
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, named after us. Yeah, and us named after it.
And how long ago was that they?
I don't know when people started referring to the Catawba River, but people are referring to Catawbas, like Catawba Nation, as early as the 1600s.
You said that the state offered to buy the
Mhm.
land from the Catawbas and gave them the money to go live by the Cherokee. Why would they agree to do that, knowing that the Cherokee were not their buddies?
Why would the Catawbas agree to do that? Yeah, so why would Catawbas agree to that? We don't really know. One of the critiques of the treaty era, which is partly this era up until the mid to late 1800s when the United States stops making treaties with tribes, is that oftentimes only one or two people would be asked in a community. There's no sense of actual consensus coming from the community. And so it's very possible that one or two leaders were paid off for it, were offered other things for it. It could also be that they thought that maybe it would be better to be around another tribe than it would be completely surrounded at this point by non-tribal people. All right, moving forward, Treaty of 1840. That is the treaty in which all that land was given up and we were trying to be sent to the Cherokees, didn't work out. But there's only one problem with this treaty of 1840, which is that it's unconstitutional. Any guesses why that treaty might have been unconstitutional?
You have to work with the federal government.
Very good. So only the federal government can make treaties, right? South Carolina can't make a treaty with Russia or France or England. And the Constitution lays out very clearly that tribes are treated with in the same way that these foreign powers are. And so South Carolina is not allowed to make a treaty. Only the federal government is allowed to make a treaty. The federal government was not a party to this treaty. So we're going to flash forward again. 1924 is the first time that citizenship is granted in the United States for all people and tribes. Any guess why this year? Like why 1924?
World War One.
Yeah, World War I. World War I, Native Americans had, still to this day, have the highest per capita enrollment rate in the military. And kind of as a reward for that, people were like, well, it's kind of weird that they're fighting for the United States and are not citizens of the United States. Some tribes wanted this. Catawbas specifically really wanted to be citizens of the United States with the hope that we would get more rights through that. Other tribes did not. So for example, Haudenosaunee to this day, a lot of my friends who are Haudenosaunee will only travel with their Haudenosaunee passport, not the United States passport. There's a whole story with lacrosse that's very interesting about that. But South Carolina said, you might be citizens of the United States, but you're still not citizens of South Carolina. The Indian Reorganization Act and Federal Recognition, this happens in 1934. And it's basically the attempt by the United States to kind of clarify its relationship with all of these different tribes across the United States. And so it creates this status called federal recognition, which means that the federal government recognizes a tribe as existing and the United States having a relationship with that tribe. Part of the requirement of that is that each tribe has to create a constitution. If you don't have a constitution, the United States says, don't worry about it. We have a template constitution and we'll just go ahead and send it out to all of you. So Chief Samuel Taylor Blue was our chief at the time. This is how most people in our community remember him. This is how he is documented mostly by other people. The headdress he's wearing is not traditional for Catawbas, but Catawbas at the time feel the same pressure that we feel today, which is having to perform a sense of being native so that our claims can be heard by people, can be understood by people. So a lot of the time when politicians, et cetera, would show up, he would be asked to put on this outfit. So 1941, Catawba Nation is federally recognized. 1944, Catawba Nation adopts the Indian Reorganization Act Constitution, which sets up our nation essentially as a business where you have the board or the executive committee, which I'm serving on, and then you have all of the citizens, which are essentially like stockholders, stakeholders. And this is almost identical to constitutions found all across Indian country. And the only issue is that it's really not an effective way to govern. And so Catawba Nation, like a lot of other tribes, are trying to enact constitutional reform. One of the biggest issues is that to do that, you have to get a certain number of people participating in any given vote. And that is often very, very, very difficult to get to happen. So 1944 is also when South Carolina finally recognizes Indians as citizens, but still can't vote. That wouldn't happen for a few more years. And so this is an important moment. Lots of things are happening. There's even money being spent by the federal government to buy back illegally taken lands in Catawba Nation and elsewhere. And then less than a decade after Catawba is federally recognized, the United States institutes a new policy called the era of termination, which is their word for it, not ours. But it is still a very apropos name because in this era, the United States would go into various tribes and they would essentially say through an act of Congress, you no longer exist as a tribal nation. So in 1959, the Catawba Termination Act was passed through Congress. And so at that moment, in the eyes of the federal government, Catawba Nation no longer existed, which means that we no longer existed as a political entity. We no longer had access to our rights regarding land, culture, language, etc. And we're just any other citizen of South Carolina and the United States. But on the tail of this is this massive movement of Native American activists. Red Power movement is what it's often called, the American Indian movement. This is a picture from the occupation of Alcatraz in the late 1960s, in which the logic of the protest was, well, Alcatraz isn't being used anymore, and one of our treaties says that any unused federal land goes back to the tribes, so we're taking it over. And in this occupation, they develop a newspaper, a radio station, a school, like kind of an amazing moment. And that continues to grow and grow and grow, and it puts pressure particularly on President Nixon, which is weird because he's often viewed as the change in United States policy towards tribes. He actually ends the era of termination and starts to usher in what's called the era of self-determination, which is what we're in at this moment. The idea behind self-determination is administration of programs, designing of programs, all of that stuff is handled by the tribes themselves through a relationship with the federal government, because who knows the needs of the tribe the best? The tribe. And so you see this giant growth in governance, in monies for education, in all these different areas, and this development of really strong government institutions. Fortunately, Catawba is left out of that because, remember, we have been terminated. And ending the era of termination does not automatically make us a federal tribe again. So in the 1970s, on this era of Indian activism, my grandfather and other leaders in Catawba Nation reorganized the tribe, bring back together the council, reaffirm the Constitution, and to begin a multi-decade-long battle with the state of South Carolina and the federal government. I won't get into details of how that happened. It's very interesting, very fascinating. But in 1993, all of those fights come to fruition, and the Catawba Settlement Act is signed into federal law. Why is it called Settlement Act? Because that treaty from 1840 was our primary piece of leverage. This treaty is illegal, which means all of this development in Fort Mill, Rock Hill, all of the Carowinds, all of that is illegal. Nothing can be constructed here until this is resolved. And of course, that hit lots of people's pocketbooks, or threatened to. And so that was the leverage we were able to use to get our federal recognition back in 1993. So my grandfather was part of that. My mom was a big part of that as well. So I was born kind of into that era. It was a really politicizing moment. So a lot of people of my generation have a very strong idea of what it takes to be able to fight for your sovereignty and what is required of that. And so, yes.
I vaguely remember all of that in the media way back then.
Oh yeah.
But what you gained was political aspects, not actually land acquisition.
Very good.
Acquisition. Is
Yeah.
that correct?
Yes, the question is if we gained back any land, and no, we didn't gain back any land. We gained back our federal status, which means that our lands are protected federally, for example. It also means that we have access to certain programs and funding for our tribal government. And it does give us the ability to reacquire land.
That's what I said.
Mhm.
So you do have the authorization to buy a private piece of property
Yep.
that's within the confines, whatever,
Mhm.
and designate that as sovereign.
Yeah, so it's kind of a complicated process. We don't actually determine whether or not it's put into trust, is what it's called. That's a function of the federal government, the Department of Interior, but we have the right to petition for that. And I will say in most every case that we've petitioned for land to be put in trust, it's been granted by the Department of Interior. It just sometimes takes a really long time to do that. But yeah, so we have that right. If anyone's been following the development of our casino out in Kings Mountain, that was part of that process in which we purchased land and would put it into trust, so that is technically sort of part of our reservation up there. Yeah.
So you have to buy back your own land?
Yes. Yes, we have to buy back our own land.
Get any assistance?
No, almost. So there is a good bit of funding for tribes. I mean, relatively small, but huge for us. But all of that funding, almost none of that funding can be used for purchasing land. It's also all of these federal programs, almost all of them have a non-construction agreement with it. And so if you come down to our reservation, almost the only infrastructure you find on our reservation is houses through a housing program, and then a few government buildings that were all developed in this post-settlement era when we were able to use some of that settlement money. So we did get some money through that settlement, use some of that to develop our longhouse, that's our government building, The other piece of land that I showed you on that map earlier, purchased that back. Our cultural set, like all these things we were able to do in that era. And since then, the late 1990s, early 2000s, nothing has been built on the reservation. And that's because there was almost no access to funding, and we had no revenue of our own to speak of until very, very recently. Yeah. Yes.
I'm sorry to backtrack a little bit.
Please.
But I was curious, so during the era of termination, the US government through like Congress took a legislative decision to be like, this is not, like the Catawba Nation is not a nation anymore. What stops them from doing that again? Like, do they maintain the power to make decisions about who it? And I'm having trouble understanding how that works with the US Constitution. Like, you can't, the Congress can't decide that Germany isn't Germany.
Yes. Okay.
So
Great
what-
question. How do they have the legal authority to do this? I mean, we would argue that they don't ever, but the way that it was done is that they had to go into tribes and get a vote from the tribe on whether or not to do it. In our case, they came in and they had a meeting with 10 people, none of which were elected officials. And they were saying things like, hey, right now, all your land is technically owned by the federal government, so you can't buy or sell it to be able to feed your family. Don't you want to get out from under the foot of the federal government so that you can buy and sell your own land to be able to feed your family? Which was a convincing argument for people who have no money, right? And so that's the legal authority that they use, is that they said that they got consent of the tribe, even though neither by numbers or by our constitution did they have consent of the combination. Yeah, good question. But the piece that you said at the beginning, what stops them from doing it again? Nothing. And so that is why we must remain vigilant about these things. Policy changes very rapidly in relation to tribes. It constantly does.
Well, I'm just gonna really quickly add that we have that ability to some degree when we vote.
Yes.
That's one of the things that I hold near and dear to, that if we don't stand up for other communities, they don't get the help of, of getting the right people in the government who are not going to do stupid stuff.
And we, the last thing I'll say about this is a whole nother area that we haven't talked at all about in this, and we won't have time to talk about it, is in the judicial branch. And so much of the relationship between the United States and tribes has been decided through the judicial branch. And particularly in the modern era, one of the issues is that you have people who get all the way to the Supreme Court who have never once studied Indian law, which is a whole different animal from basically every other area of law. And that's why you see, when you look at Indian law cases, my mom is a lawyer, so I'm thinking about laws and the courts and all that stuff. When you look back at these cases, very few of them rely on precedent or referring back to previous cases. And it's often just based on the whims of whoever is sitting there and what they feel like the law should actually be in relationship to tribes. And so that's a very scary place. We had a big scare this summer, one on one case, which is great, and then lost huge on a different case, which is kind of scary.
Is it really difficult to get your artwork back and your antiquities and things like that? Is it harder for that than the land, or equally hard?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So is it hard to get back important objects to us? In the early 1900s, one person commented that there were more dead Indians in the vaults of the Smithsonian than there were live Indians on the continent. He was exaggerating a little bit, but not by too much. And this was an issue that was not addressed until 1990 and 1991 with the passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which is a mouthful. We call it NAGPRA. And so it sets up a couple of rules. One, that you can't display Native American bodies in museums anymore. 1990, but this is a rule. And two, that every institution in the United States that is receiving federal dollars that has bodies or pieces of cultural patrimony or cultural importance has to go through a process of reviewing it and starting negotiations with tribes on if they want it returned. Some tribes don't want it because they don't have the infrastructure in place to be able to take these things back. But some do, like we really do. There's a couple problems. With bodies, it's very clear. that is something that needs to take place, but what is something of cultural importance? And how do you determine that? Well, I would say you come and talk to us, but institutions are often trying to do an internal audit, and then they come out and say, these are the things that we think might be important to you. And will you want to bring them back? The other issue is which tribes take part in that process. So like in this region, let's say something is found, an hour west of here. Is that the Cherokee or is that Catawba? Right, and how do you determine it? The other issue is that private institutions who don't receive federal dollars are not obligated under this law. So we just had an issue this past spring of the skull of a small child that had been found at an archaeological site in North Carolina. It was being put on an auction website. It was privately owned, it was privately auctioned. We had no legal authority to do anything. So what we did do was we put it all over social media. And we said, this is gross. Why are people buying and selling skulls of children? And they thankfully took it down, but it's still in private possession by someone. And then there's a whole other issue of international markets. None of these international markets have any obligation. And so you will see all the time, particularly in French auction houses, really important objects. I remember one elder talking about her grandmother's baby board, basically like a baby basket, was being sold at a French auction. And there was nothing that could be done to be able to get that piece back. And it's beautiful, so much, like our artists really love these objects because our potters can look at a piece of pottery and say like, this is what they were doing. Like this is the kind of skills and craft that they were using and really learn from those objects. But yeah, so that's an ongoing issue. Interesting, the one federal institution that was exempted from the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, the Smithsonian. They were given similar guidance in what was called the National Museum of the American Indian Act, which also establishes the National Museum of the American Indian. I remember when it was first opened, because all the tribes were invited to come to the celebration. I just remember my mom being so pissed about it. I was like, why is she so mad? And it was because they had that she felt, as many other people still feel, that they had used this as a way of slowing down that process. And there are still so many objects at the Smithsonian. When I was living in DC, our cultural center asked me to be the NAGPRA repatriation officer. And I was there for 4 years. For my first year there, I kept requesting times to go and see the collections of Catawba objects. And they kept delaying. Literally my entire time in DC, I never once got to go and see the collections of what they have that are Catawba at the Smithsonian. Yeah, so as you can tell, that's a touchy point for us, right? It's a continued issue, but yeah, thank you for the question. Great, okay, I just have a few more things I'm gonna mention and we're gonna get going. So if you have more questions, bring them up. So here we are, in this moment, we have so how do we heal that circle that I've been talking about? So I want to briefly talk about 4 plants and things we've learned from them. The first is peaches. Peaches. So by the 1600s, when explorers are coming into the interior of the Carolinas, they're noting giant groves of peaches everywhere, which is kind of confounding because peaches are not from here, right? How did they get here? Well, when the Spanish came through, they brought peaches with them. Catawbas tasted them, other people tasted them and said, wow, these are delicious. Let's see if they grow. And they started to grow. And then they said, let's grow lots of these things, right? Now, why is this significant? Because when I started working on our food sovereignty work, the first thing that Dr. Brooke Bauer, she's a cousin of ours, she's written an amazing book about Catawba history, first Catawba historian in history. She said to me, hey, Rue, you should check out, this explorer text, particularly what he says about peaches. And it got me to thinking, well, Catawbas don't have this attitude historically of, no, nothing new. We're not going to accept anything new. Instead, it's what can we bring in? What can we bring in a good way? What's useful for us and what's delicious, right? And so peaches were an early lesson for us on that. And of course, on the other end, we have things that aren't from here that really send the ecosystem into a tailspin. This is a picture, I believe, of some privet and silverberry. And if you were on the walk yesterday, there's a portion of the trail where you just get surrounded by privet and silverberry. And so part of what I think about is like, what isn't there because the privet and silverberry is there? And Robert probably talked about the river cane, which is an important plant for us in a lot of ways. But one of the reasons it's really hard for it to grow on our reservation is it keeps getting shaded out, keeps getting pulled down when it's young by some of the vining invasives. So yeah, just something to think about. And then something very close to my heart, which is kus, which is corn. When I started doing food sovereignty work with my community, the first thing that was brought up by our elders, that was brought up by people in our meeting was, we got to get the corn. We got to find the corn. We got to bring back the corn. And this is corn that was grown all the way up until I was a little kid, right? But as Catawbas through the last half of the 1900s are more and more able to go to school, able to participate in the local economy, there's less and less time for actually farming and gardening for subsistence reasons. And so this corn by the 1990s has disappeared. And so we asked around to some of our farmers that were still farming. We asked around to elders, do you have any seeds maybe in your attic somewhere? No one could find any. And so I reached out to this guy named Dr. David Shields. This group, people in this group met him before. Very interesting guy in South Carolina, works a lot on heritage seed varieties, but his academic discipline is actually musicals. But I reached out to him after hearing about him and all the work he'd done kind of bringing these traditional seeds back to different communities. And he was like, yeah, I'll look into it. I was like, oh, whatever, he's not gonna look into it. 3 months later, he emails me and says, I was just at a seed trial at the North Carolina Extension Office, and I think that we might have found this corn. And so it was a corn that had been labeled Leal Flint corn. It was grown in Hickory, North Carolina. The family, when they gave it to North Carolina, said that they'd gotten this corn variety from the Indians. We were the only Indians in the area at the time. And then also, importantly, it matches the visual description in our historical records. It also matches the number of rows when you look around it from our archaeological sites, because you can tell from the corn cobs that are actually in those archaeological sites. And so in 2020, we got the seeds back. In April, we start planting them about a month into COVID, thinking, you know, COVID's going to blow over pretty soon. Of course, it did not. And unfortunately, our tribe instituted a very strict COVID policy. Like many tribes, we took it very seriously. And so we weren't able to go back outside to those spots and actually take care of the corn. And so we were like, great, it's all going to die, right? We come back at the end of the summer and the plants are huge. They're beautiful. They've got so many ears of corn. And then we peel back the ears and we see this beautiful set of colors on them. One of our citizens calls this the drag queen of corn, which I get an agreement with. And so we grew it off and on for several years. And then 2 years ago, we got a new natural resources director. Natural resources also oversees our farm. He's a tribal citizen. He's also an ecologist. His name is Aaron Baumgartner. And he really has taken the reins on revitalizing this corn. Working with Davidson College to grow out huge amounts of it. Part of what we're doing now is trying to develop various different color strains of this corn to try and get that, get something a little bit more marketable. But what we've been doing for right now is all of this corn has been processed into meal and grits and then given out for free to our tribal community. But along with that, it's not just the food, right? And it's not just the seeds, like we got the seeds, we also have to learn how to process the seeds because this is a flour corn. You can't just eat it like sweet corn. So bringing back that nixtamalization process, using that wood ash to make it edible, but not just the cooking process, but all of the pieces around it. So for example, bringing back our green corn dance, which is a dance associated with the corn. Bringing back our traditions of making corn husk dolls. And so we had an elder who still remembers making corn husk dolls as a kid. And so she's been teaching classes on how to make those corn husk dolls. We have our weavers looking at how to make use of the corn husks and things like rugs and mats and other things as well. In addition to this corn, the Catawba flower corn, we actually very recently got word from a farm in a tribe in New York, the Onondaga farm, and they have a seed sanctuary there of hundreds and hundreds of different corn varieties from all over the place that this guy had collected. And their responsibility now is to give those seeds back to those communities. And so they called us up and they said, hey, we've got a corn variety here of yours. And so like, great, can you send it to us? And they said, no, we do not send anything in the mail. So Aaron and I flew up to Onondaga near Buffalo. We get out, we go to the seed sanctuary, beautiful, amazing work that they're doing out there. And we look at this corn and it says Catawba sweet corn, and it's completely black. So imagine a sweet corn that is completely black. Now, the only problem is that it was last grown in 1985. These seeds were last grown in 1985. And so right now we are working with Davidson's evolutionary plant biologist to do some high-tech stuff that I do not understand, but that I'm very excited about, to try and bring back that corn. A few months ago, we actually heard from another person that they had the same variety, but that was more recent, grown in the early 1990s. So we're trying that as well to be able to get something that we can grow again. So it's a very exciting time if you love corn. Another one is Singuenunti, which is the not the Georgia aster, sorry, the Schweinet sunflower, which I'm sure if any group is familiar with this, it's you all. An interesting piece of this is that because we are trust land, because we are technically our land is technically federally owned, it means that if we are to dig up the Schweinet sunflower to use the roots for food or traditional uses, we actually can't. It would be a violation of the Endangered Species Act. And so what we've actually been working on is an agreement between Catawba Nation and Fish and Wildlife Service, the first of its kind, that would allow for the taking of the responsible and moderate taking of pieces of the plant for use by the community in a ceremonial way. This has not been used by any other tribe before, but we're hoping that this is a model that can be used by other tribes moving forward. And part of the reason why is we often think of conservation as don't touch it, right? Don't touch it. Part of what we believe is that actually through the process of harvesting in small amounts, we can actually invigorate the plant, right? In the same way that you might weed an area, right? If you make some space for the plant to grow into, if you disrupt it a little bit, maybe it'll grow back better. Recently, there was some construction right near our reservation where there was a bunch of Schweinet sunflower, and within a year or two, the population absolutely boomed along that area because the tubers are turned up, spread around. So that's another cool plant for us. And then of course, fire, right? We are working on bringing back controlled burning in various places. The first place is in our about 400-acre hunting preserve, which is not federal trust land. It's just fee simple title land. And we're doing controlled burns there to make it a better habitat for the deer and other things that our citizens want to hunt, but also to better take care of the environment. Before these burns, it was just a pine plantation, but we're working on bringing back a lot of these native plants, these prairie species. And the hope is one day we'll be able to do some limited control burns on our reservation. Part of the problem is, again, because we are federal trust land, any sorts of forestry actions we take on a reservation has to be approved by the federal government. And we are talking about very tiny areas, so it's very difficult to get the federal government to respond in a timely manner. And currently our plan says that there are no controlled burns allowed on our reservation, which, as I mentioned before, is traditional for us. So this is another avenue that we're exploring for kind of reweaving that circle for us. And then the last one is my favorite, Passiflora incarnata. Love this plant. And part of why I love it is the way that it dies back every winter, and you think it's gone, and yet it springs back. And so this is a metaphor that we're looking at for a lot with our community. These last 500 years have taken away so much of our knowledge, of our traditions, and yet we still have these things that were hard fought for, that were preserved. And so now we're trying to figure out how can we reweave those things together into something that can hold not just us now, but for many, many future generations. As I always say, we're trying to be here for at least another 6,000 years. If you are too, then let's figure out how we can work together to make that happen. And then last, I'll recommend 2 books. If you haven't read Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, please read it. It's brilliant. And then Becoming Catawba, particularly if you're interested in that history from the 1700s into the 1800s by Dr. Brooke Bauer, or as I call her, cousin Brooke. That is another amazing text to check out.
Robin Kimmerer was actually here 6 months ago and did a whole presentation of these childhood.
Yeah, I opened for her at her presentation. I did a drum for her at the beginning of it. Yeah. And we were able to bring out some Catawba teens and some Catawba elders to have like a private conversation with her. It was really, really awesome event.
I have a question. Back on the slide you had when you were talking about the corn, you mentioned use of wood ash to make it edible. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes. So nixtamalization, who started this term before?
Only because I was at the festival last year.
Oh, okay, great. Yes, nixtamalization. Everyone say it. Nixtamalization. Yeah, okay, great. Top level, it's where you take an alkaline solution and you soak the kernels in it. So you boil the kernels in an alkaline solution and let them soak overnight. What does this do? It gets rid of the indigestible outer skin of the corn and also makes the rest of the corn digestible. So if you eat flour corn like this, which is sometimes done for tortillas and stuff like that, it is not super healthy, right? I mean, it's fine, but you need other things. If you process the corn through that nixtamalization process, it becomes a complete grain. So you can survive off of just this corn. Interestingly, when Spanish explorers and other Europeans took corn from the Americas over to Europe, they brought the seeds, but they didn't bring the traditions with them. And so you start seeing this new disease popping up in Europe and then later in the American South called pellagra, which is specifically from a niacin deficiency because people are eating corn unprocessed. And which is why when you look at tribal communities in the Southeast during the horrible pellagra pandemics, which is just a malnutrition, essentially, tribal communities were essentially not affected by it because they're still using this traditional processing technique. And the thing that keyed us off to this was I actually asked one of our elders, I was like, okay, so you remember the corn, do you remember like, what did you prepare it? And she said, I remember them putting wood ash in the boiling water. And I can't remember, I have no idea why they did that. And that led us down this path of learning about nixtamalization and this tradition that all over the Americas, any place that corn came to in the Americas, also not a native species, but came here at some point in the past. Anywhere it went, nixtamalization came with it because it's such an essential part of using corn.
Is that all corn?
All flour corn. So sweet corn you can eat just fine, no problem.
I can't.
Well, not you. One might be able to eat it just fine.
If I corn do something like this and have corn again, my system is so hypersensitive to corn that I don't eat it.
You might want to consider it, but also if you've had masa before, like maseca, that is nixtamalized corn. So it's been through that process already. Yeah, hominy is a nixtamalized corn. It's used in a lot of places, but not traditionally used, which is why like grits, cornmeal, those are not nixtamalized for most of the time. But most Latin American corn flours are nixtamalized. Yeah. All right, other questions?
Can you mention to everyone about the festival?
Yes, absolutely. So every year we have our big harvest festival called Yap Yen Iswa, the Day of the River People. It is always the last Saturday before Thanksgiving, which this year I believe means it is November 18th. Thank you very much. It is down at the Catawba Cultural Center, just outside Rock Hill. And it is completely free and open to the public. So we have dancing, we have music, we have our artists selling lots of things. Robert is probably going to be giving another trail walk if you want to learn more about plants. Dr. Brooke Bauer will probably be there giving a history talk. Our lawyers will talk about more legal history if you want to learn about that. I'll be bouncing around from place to place as needed. But it's a great time. I really encourage you to come out and check it out. Yeah. Other questions?
What's your relationship now with Cherokee?
I mean, do you have one? Is it on
So there's kind of two levels to it. One is on the nation to nation level, particularly as it relates to economics. And I will say that during our fight for our casino, and there's a whole reason why casinos are so synonymous with tribes, and it's not because we particularly love casinos, it's because it's one of the few places that tribes have been able to create a business advantage. During that 15-year or so fight, 25-year or so fight, Eastern Band Cherokee has fought against us, and I completely understand why, which is that we're looking at creating and have now created a casino in one of their feeder markets to their casinos out in Western North Carolina. That being said, every time I visited Eastern Band, I have there is so much love for Catawba Nation, and I also one person was like, I just want to apologize for how our leadership has been treating you. We just don't think it's right. And I was like, well, thank you. That's so nice. So there is, and this is true across tribes, tribes who were ferocious enemies for hundreds of years, who were now of this kind of understanding of we can crack jokes about our ancestors fighting and all this stuff, but this understanding that we all have to work together, particularly in our advocacy with the federal government and around the laws of the federal government. And a big piece of that is from that Red Power movement, this generation of Native people that were, a lot of them, forced to move into cities, and getting there and having these conversations being like, oh, your children were put in boarding schools. Oh, your whole family was in the military. Oh, all these things, your treaty was broken, having that understanding. And that's kind of grown from that moment. So yeah, still work to be done. But I think there's a lot of hope there, and we learn a lot from them. A lot of our departments will go up there to learn things, particularly our natural resources department. As they got started, they went up there because they've had an amazing natural resources department for a long time. So a lot that we can learn from them as well. Yeah, thank you for the question. Yes.
So I'm kind of sticking with this whole religion thing because it's near and dear to my heart. Are more people, like you mentioned that there's a lot of Mormon and that are more people putting that aside and truly taking what was there before colonialism forced those religions on them? I
wouldn't say putting aside, but I would say constantly integrating it together. So, for example, my mother grew up Southern Baptist. She would say her whole life that she was Christian, very Christian. But if you looked at her actual practice of religion, and then you asked a theologian of that particular denomination if she was practicing Southern Baptist or Episcopalian, they would say no, what she's practicing doesn't look anything like it. And yet she still had that strong sense. And so I would say that it's more of an integration of these different ideas into one another. There's a word for it called synchronism. And you see it happening a lot in Latin American countries, Latin American places, with the introduction of Catholicism, in which traditional ideas of the earth as mother, all these things kind of get wrapped up into the Mother Mary figure. And so there's ways in which people are kind of navigating this big change. And I would say that that's continuing to this day. There are people like me who are not members of any particular faith or religion who find their spirituality in the land itself. People who still go to church every day, are very involved in the church, and yet talk about spirits and people living on the land with them in a way that I think a lot of theologians wouldn't really recognize as being a part of the religion. So I think it's a very creative time in terms of spirituality. Yeah.
Someone in the chat online who's joining us, they're from Ecuador, and they mentioned the term La Pachamama, which is the term that they use. This is the same sort of tying the two together.
Yeah, gracias. Great. Yes.
You mentioned that you are LGBT.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering what the relationship is like. What's the acceptance of LGBT?
Yeah, so a lot of tribes have these strong traditions of more than two genders, right? By the time we had linguists coming to our area, anthropologists, we had been surrounded by non-Catawbas and particularly Christianity for a long time. And on top of that, when the linguists were asking questions about gender, it typically went like this: what's your word for man? Okay, what's your word for woman? Okay, we're done, right? And not really having that curiosity. And so unfortunately, if those roles and identities did exist, we don't have them today. That being said, I grew up with a very strong sense that it was possible to be LGBT, that it was possible to have a life partner, to be a part of your community while you're doing that. I have lots of relatives while I was growing up who had been married to same-sex partners there, since I had always known them. And so I was very lucky. I think part of that is that even though most Catawbas are part of religions that are honestly pretty homophobic, there's also this strong kind of laissez-faire attitude towards sexuality and romance that extends in lots of different directions. But so that's kind of the sense that I grew up with. And what's cool is that now we're in this position of like, okay, so we don't know if it was there in the past, and yet we get to decide what our future looks like. And at the same time that we're coming up with words for like cell phone or computer, we can come up with terms for what it means to be LGBT in Catawba Nation. Alex Osborne, who's an artist you saw earlier, is someone who's part of that conversation, as well as elders who are part of the LGBT community, young people, and being creative about it, thinking about it. One figure that comes up repeatedly is the butterfly, Dapanenehi, because in many ways, the butterfly in that creation story is the one that brings gender into the story itself by introducing first woman and first man and sky man. Yeah.
Isn't there also something called two-spirited? Is that their term for transgender?
Yeah, and it comes from some tribal, the term two-spirit was the question. It comes from some tribes that have that tradition, and it kind of became a pan-indigenous idea in the early 1990s at this LGBT Native American conference. And so I use it sometimes in certain contexts, not really at home, because most people in my community don't recognize that term. But also in some communities, they will not use that term, because to be of two spirits or two hearts or two minds is a bad thing. You don't want to be of two spirits or two hearts or two minds. So they use other terms. Like I've heard from some Cherokee Tsalagi people that that's not a term that would be a positive thing in their language. So yeah, two-spirit is a term that you'll hear sometimes. Yes.
I'm kind of interested to hear about, like, when you mentioned the more laissez-faire approach to various things. I'm wondering, in your community or in like Catawba society, because I wonder, because we're in the context of like the overturn of Roe versus Wade, what have the attitudes generally been towards the reproductive sovereignty of women?
Oh, that's a big question. And to be honest, I haven't had that conversation with a lot of people. But what I will say is that my Catawba mother has always been very staunchly pro choice, pro rights of women to choose, and particularly because she remembers the pre-Roe v. Wade days. And so that was what I was raised in, and so that's what I fight for as well. But it's also, but for us, I think what we're trying to think of is more around reproductive health as well. So not just whether or not that choice is available to people, but also particularly around neonatal and prenatal health. In these conversations we've had in our community, I've not heard a single person whose life has not been impacted by postpartum depression. It has been everywhere in our community, people who have dealt with the death of newborns and infants, environmental poisons like lead poisoning, asbestos, those sorts of things. And so I think any conversation we have about abortion is also part of the larger conversation about do Catawba women, do Catawba people have the power and the ability to be able to raise their families in a healthy context, in a healthy way, if that's what they choose.
What is the how big is the nation? Like how many?
In terms of population, we have about 3,800 citizens. About 1,000 live on a reservation right off of it. Another 1,000 live throughout the kind of Carolina Piedmont region, and then the final about 1,000 live all over the place. So there's a fairly large contingent in Oklahoma, a fairly large contingent in Utah, but I also have cousins who grew up in Germany, people down in Brazil, like all over the place. Yeah, which also is a very difficult issue of governance because every other state, county, you're just dealing with people who live in those states and those counties. When you think about your constituencies, we're thinking about people who live hundreds or thousands of miles away from us. And so how do you practice governance? How do you serve those people? It's complicated. Yeah. All right. One more question, then we'll end it.
That's it. Well, I'm foggy about, what portion, if any, of like US law is the nation's, obliged to.
Yeah, good
follow?
question. Very good question. So what portions of the laws are tribes and citizens of tribes obligated to follow? So I'll give you the general and then I'll give the specifics for Catawba Nation. So generally, tribes are not subject to the laws of states, counties, cities that might intersect with their reservation. So for example, Navajo Nation out west, they intersect with many different states, I think 4 or 5 different states, and they are not beholden to the laws of any of those states. They have their own laws. So, we think of the federal system of all these states working together. It's helpful to think of all these states and tribal nations. So often they're considered, you can think of them as kind of on the same level. That being said, we're under all of the laws of the federal government. And that happened through a piecemeal process. For example, we became under the laws of what's called the Major Crimes Act, so murder, kidnapping, those sorts of things in the 1800s, but we didn't get under the Bill of Rights until the 1960s. So it's kind of been a weird process. Now, Catawba Nation, because of that settlement act that I talked about before that we had to fight for, we are what's often called a limited sovereignty tribe. So our sovereignty is limited in a few key ways. One, we're not under the National Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, which is a mouthful. We are subject to the state's gaming laws. 2, we are under the police jurisdiction of York County. So that means York County Police can come on and off our reservation as they see fit, not true of almost every other reservation. And we're doing some things actually to negotiate that relationship. And then the third is that unlike almost every other person in the United States, we had to pay for our children to go to public school in South Carolina. And part of the reasoning was that if we put a bunch of land into trust status, we bought a bunch of land and put it into trust status, that would take it out of the property tax base in South Carolina, which is how they funded the schools. We didn't put any land under that property tax, and the land that was our reservation already wasn't taxed. And so that has been a major sticking point for us. It almost made the whole negotiations with the settlement fall apart in 1992. But anyways, fast forward to 2008, they stopped funding schools in South Carolina that way. And yet we still had a $4 million debt to the Rock Hill School District. In 2014, they sued us for that, put a lien on our land so that we couldn't do any construction, buying or selling of any of our non-reservation lands. And so in 2016, 2017, we settled that debt by giving them $2 million worth of our land. Which is, so when we talk about land dispossession, it's not 1959, it's not 1840, it's 2017. Yeah,